I remember I was very fortunate. I was just now having dinner with the fathers and with some other beloved members of your parish. And we were talking, one of the things we were talking about was living in Rome. I remember I was fortunate enough to live in Rome during the last years of Pope St. John Paul II, and especially the last week of Pope John Paul II, because everyone pretty much knew this is going to be his last week. His health was so bad, and he was, in and out of hospitals, and it just was not looking good. And I remember it was Easter Day. He was going to give his Easter blessing from his window like he always did. And he just recently had his throat operated on, so we weren't even sure if he was going to be able to speak or not. But St. Peter's Square, which holds about 100,000 people, was packed. And then if you've ever seen pictures of the Vatican, it's got these two colonnades that are kind of wrap around. It's supposed to symbolize like two arms that wrap around the church, if you wish, the plaza of St. Peter's Square. Well, you've got these gigantic, thick columns, but in between the columns, because they're columns, there are spaces. And wherever there was a space where you could get a view of the Pope's window, there were like these spokes going out into the streets of people trying to look up and see the Pope. Because we knew we were in the last days of the life of a saint. And people wanted to be present to hear the last words and to be present in the last moments of the life of a great saint. Unfortunately, that day, John Paul II was not able to say a thing. He tried a couple of times to read his little discourse and blessing. He couldn't even do that. And so you see him with his Parkinson. He's kind of frustrated looking. He gives the blessing and just kind of pushes the microphone away and kind of moves on. But people understood this is a man who is giving everything he has up until the last, and they wanted to be present for that. And the reality is, when you know that death is present, that is the moment that people traditionally will open up their hearts and reveal what is in there. And this is precisely what we're commemorating in the life of Christ. The Son of God opening up his heart and revealing the things that are most important in the 7 last words. So the first word, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. That sounds nice and poetic whenever Jesus in the gospel talks about forgive people, forgive your neighbors, and we all think, wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we all did that? Until we have somebody ourselves that we have to forgive. Then all of a sudden it doesn't sound so poetic or wonderful. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus didn't just say, let's make the world a nice place and forgive each other. Forgive your brother. He went beyond that. Jesus went so far as to say, forgive your enemies. That is a very hard thing to do. Was he just being, like I said, poetic? Forgive your enemies? Well, in case you think it was rhetoric, at the crucifixion, Jesus was the first to put it into practice. Interestingly enough, for those of you for people who are smart at languages, I'm not, I just read what smart people have to say about it. The Gospels were written in Greek, which was kind of the cool language of the eastern half of the Roman Empire when Jesus was alive. Back from the days of Alexander the Great, he had conquered that half of the Mediterranean. And the words, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do, is not just a one-time thing. Apparently, in the verb tense, it was in the infinitive verb tense, which means that it was something that Jesus was repeating regularly. So they would throw an insult at him, and he would say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And they would say something else or do something else, Father, forgive them. So it was an ongoing prayer that Jesus was doing. Now here's the thing, in my own reflections. Was Jesus telling the truth? They don't know what they're doing. If you read scriptures, there's a little bit of a dilemma, at least in my primitive mind. Why? John chapter 8, Jesus' own words, he had said the following to the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the priests. When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am. So what he's saying there is, when you crucify me, and the word, again, to lift up was a word apparently used only for, like, lifting somebody up on a cross. It wasn't like when you pick up your child. It was He's telling them straight up in chapter 8, when you crucify me, then you will know that I am. The word I am in Hebrew is Yahweh. He's saying, you'll know that I'm God in that moment. But in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 3, St. Peter is talking to the crowds. He says, now I know, brothers, that you acted out of ignorance just as your leaders did. So how do we reconcile this? Jesus on the one hand saying, you will know that I'm God when you see me crucified, and the other people, his apostles saying later, well, I know that you guys didn't really know what you were doing, otherwise you would have never dared to crucify him, right? Well, I think there's different kinds of knowledge and different ways that we can know in the Bible. In the Bible, there's a difference between knowledge, belief, and love. So, in biblical terms, you can't really truly know somebody unless you love them. For example, here's a classic example. Adam knew Eve, and the result of that knowledge was Cain and Abel. Clearly, there's a different kind of knowledge happening than what you would normally say, oh yeah, I know Joe, right? And in the Bible, there are a lot of different connotations like that, where true knowledge comes from the fact that you cannot truly know a person until you love them. It seems almost counterintuitive, because normally you would think you can't love somebody until you know them, right? Well, there's kind of a circular action happening. On the one hand, you can't love a person until you know them, but then the more you know them, the more you begin to love them. The more you love them, the more deeply you know a person. I guarantee you know your spouse much better now than you did when you were married and you were infatuated. And you probably love your spouse, you hopefully love your spouse more now than when you were in honeymoon stage and you were still infatuated, even though you don't feel all the butterflies and all the goodies that we normally tend to feel when you are recently married or still engaged. So, in the case of the scribes and Pharisees, they saw the crucifixion, they saw the prophecies being fulfilled before their very eyes, and they, quote-unquote, knew what was happening, but they did not accept that this was God. And in that sense, they can't truly know because they refuse to accept. That, in biblical terms, is called hardness of heart. When Jesus talks all the time about the scribes and Pharisees closing their hearts and being hard of heart and whatnot, that's what he's talking about. The sin of the Holy Spirit that cannot be forgiven. That's one very legitimate interpretation, is to simply to see the truth. You see Jesus is working miracles. You have absolutely no other explanation. This must be God, but I simply don't want to accept it, so I won't. Okay. And this was the tragedy of the men who were called to lead the Jewish people in their faith. The tragedy of the religious leadership of Israel. And the same thing can be true. I mean, I'm the priest. I'm supposed to be the professional in religion here, but the same can be true of you as parents. If there's some little element to the faith that we simply say, well, I know the church teaches that, but I'm not really going to buy into that, then we also are called as parents to lead our families in the faith, and that has consequences. When we voluntarily just say, wow, there's this little element of the church's teaching that I just don't buy because I don't like it. Okay? When that happens, the people who pay for it are our children. The second word. Truly, truly, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. We know that Jesus was speaking to the good thief, right? Interestingly enough, only St. Luke mentions the good thief being the good thief. The other Gospels mention that everybody, including both thieves, were reviling Jesus. So it seems that at the beginning, 3 men were crucified. 2 of them were aiming all of their ammunition at the one in the middle, and the one in the middle was praying for everybody around him. And you ask yourself, why would the other 2 thieves, you would think they're all condemned, they're all dying, why would they feel it within their rights and their prerogative, and why would they feel inclined at all to focus on Jesus? Well, there was a difference between Jesus and the two thieves. Jesus stood for something. The two thieves nobody cared about because they were just thieves. They were, in a sense, harmless. Once you catch them, they're harmless. They don't stand for anything. Nobody was going to be their follower. And Jesus, on the other hand, stood for something that everybody, for one reason or another, wanted to stamp out. In the case of the Romans, they wanted to stamp him out because they viewed the world in terms of power. And Jesus represented a God who showed mercy to weakness. And that was not a doctrine that the Romans would ever be willing to accept. Mercy to the weak was insanity. To the Jewish authorities, because they saw the world in terms of legal righteousness and could not accept a God who is going to go and pardon infidelity, a God who is going to reach out to patent sinners and say, I love you, and I call you back into the fold. A God who is going to reach out to prodigal sons and daughters. That did not fit into the mind frame of the legalism of the Jewish leadership. They liked clear rules, not necessarily a change of heart, but they liked clear rules, clear-cut codes, and if you follow the rules, you're righteous, and if you don't follow the rules, you're not. Christ, the novelty that Jesus brought, it wasn't really a novelty, but the novelty in the sense of the interpretation of that time was that God wants conversion of heart. He wants there to be love, which is a different thing. If we love, we will tend to follow the rules better and more completely than the rule followers. But it's also true that if our faith is about love and not just simply commandments, then there's room for sinful people to strive and to fall and to get up and to strive and to fall and to say, Jesus, I trust in you even in the midst of my misery, that God can make me into a saint even if I keep messing up. That's a different God than what the Jewish authorities wanted. And in the thieves, they simply viewed the world in terms of profit and what they could gain, and Jesus put his treasure in heaven. So in all three cases, everybody had a reason why Jesus stood for something that they didn't want to accept. And in the middle of all this, you see Jesus, it was kind of like he was in the middle of this cyclone, right? Because he's there, the two thieves are swearing and cursing and reviling him. The scribes and Pharisees are mocking him, and it's almost like playground mockery. Like, hey, what does it feel like now, huh? You trusted in God? Well, let God save you now. And the Romans, they're just drunk and swearing and being Roman soldiers. The only people in the entire scene who acted with any dignity at all were Jesus and a little cluster of his followers, his mother and a couple of women and St. John. Everybody else, it was like they were possessed. And frankly, some of them might have been. And in the middle of this, one thief recognizes that Jesus is doing something that nobody should be able to do. He's praying, and he is forgiving. Crucifixion, by the way, when Romans recorded the crucifixion, it was so horrible. I will get into some of the details later, but it was so horrible that it said it was not uncommon that when you're crucified that you would curse your mom for giving birth to you, you would curse the day of your birth, you would curse everybody around you, would curse God, and it was not uncommon for the Romans to have to climb up on a ladder and cut out your tongue so they wouldn't have to hear the kind of things you're saying. And Jesus is saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. That he's praying. So this one thief, recognizing that there's something so different about this man, starts to question And somehow or other, God's grace is able to move his heart. And interestingly enough, the reason we call him the good thief is not because he was a thief and he was a good guy. It's because he was a thief and he was really good at being a thief. And the very last thing he did was he stole heaven. He didn't deserve it, and with his very last action, he literally stole heaven with the words, "Remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom." And he heard Jesus saying, "Indeed, I promise you, today you will be with me in paradise." It's the first person that we know of that got to go to heaven. He might have beat Abraham and Moses and all those other people that were still waiting for heaven to open up. And this guy, Jesus, says, "Today, you get in." Can you imagine that? The third word, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. So why would Christ say this? Seems kind of random. Here he is being crucified, and he looks down and he says, "Okay, woman, behold your son," St. John. "Son, behold your mother." A lot of Bible commentators simply see this as being, well, there's Jesus, and he knew that he was the only child, and his mother was already a widow, and so he needed to make sure somebody's going to take care of her, and he's just doing what any good son would do, right? Wrong. It would have been a complete breach of protocol. They had relatives. And the relatives, under ordinary circumstances, would have been expected to take Mary into their house. They had cousins and whatnot. She had siblings around. There were other people, extended family members, that are mentioned in the Gospels. For example, the parents of St. Jude Thaddeus seemingly was some sort of cousin of Jesus. His family would have been somewhere around there. So it was not simply Jesus looking out for his mom, as beautiful as that is. And I think in order to understand this, you have to go back to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12. When he says, remember he was out preaching one day, and the people say, "Hey Jesus, your mother and your brothers and sisters," which basically means cousins, by the way, so that was one of those idiosyncrasies of Hebrew and Aramaic, is the language, cousin and brother or sibling or whatever is all the same word. But your relatives and your mother are looking for you, and they want to speak to you. And instead of saying, "Hey, yeah, call them straight up," Jesus says, which would have been shocking, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So what's Jesus telling us then? Well, in an era when the Jewish covenant was passed from generation to generation through bloodline. And so, when you had children through circumcision, the males, were instituted into the covenant, and therefore only Jewish people or those who entered in through circumcision, those pagans, which was a very small percentage. But it was something that was passed biologically from generation to generation, and therefore the Jewish people have always been very conscientious about these family trees, which is why when you read the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew at Christmas, it's frankly annoying. It's like, oh no, it's a whole bunch of big names and I don't know how to pronounce them. And Father asked me to do the reading, and it's like, about 70 of them or whatever, and they're all these names. Vietnamese must be so much easier. It's just like all the words, you don't know how to pronounce it, but they're all like one syllable, so it's at least you don't like so anyway, for what it's worth. What Christ is saying then is his family relation is not going to be transmitted in the new covenant by bloodline, but is going to be transmitted by faith and by grace. The church is, from this point onward, Jesus' family. And therefore, and frankly, we have the entire church represented at the crucifixion. There were very few people there, but who were they? You have a priest present, not only a priest, bishop, an apostle at that, so, But you have the clergy present in the person of St. John. You have the laity present in the figures of the holy women. And you have the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, present. You have the entire church in a microcosm there with Christ at his crucifixion. And Jesus was basically saying, this is my family. In a special way, for the consolation of us priests, he was also saying, Mother, take care of my priests. They're going to be in a world where they need somebody. Take care of my priests. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. The fourth word, my God, why have you abandoned me? It seems scandalous that the Son of God would say those words, right? On the one hand, you can say it's a completely legitimate cry of anguish. If I were to just go into, without even taking into consideration spiritually what was happening, all you have to do is go to the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, and you'll have a good image of what was going on in Jesus' heart and physically. The scourging may have been a little bit over the top in the movie, but the reality is there was considered to be no more agonizing death physically than the crucifixion. And also, the physical part that Jesus went through was the smaller part. Spiritually, because he was bearing the weight of every sin of humanity, all of history, past, present, and future. Imagine that. Just imagine the holier you are, the closer to God you are, the more repugnant the idea of anything that offends God is. And Jesus, in a sense, took the guilt of all of that upon himself and said, I will bear responsibility for it. And on top of all of that, as if those two things weren't enough, he was surrounded by demons who were continually, abusing him and hurling, trying to bring him down and spiritually assaulting him in every way. And his church, for the most part, was missing, except for those few faithful people. And he had the religious leadership and his people who had betrayed him, and all of this was going on at the same time. So, on the one hand, it's a totally legitimate cry that he says, my God, why have you abandoned me? He felt absolutely rejected by God because he was clothed in sin, and God cannot be, you can't in a sense bring sin to God's presence. It has to be dealt with, right? But there is more to it than that. How many of you have heard of Psalm 22? You know that it exists, but you don't remember what it is, right? Well, imagine hearing these words. When the scribes and Pharisees heard Jesus say the words, my God, why have you abandoned me? They wouldn't have just said, oh, this poor guy is really going through a hard time. They would have heard him beginning the words of a psalm and seeing themselves portrayed in full three-dimensional technicolor in the middle of that psalm. The psalm that was written 1,000 years before Jesus. Now listen to some of this. These are little sections, okay? My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from my call for help, my cries of anguish? My God, I call by day, but you do not answer. At night, but I have no relief. Later on it says, I am a worm, not a man, scorned by men, despised by the people. He's surrounded by these people that are despising him. All who see me mock me. They curl their lips and jeer. They shake their heads at me. He relied on the Lord. Let him deliver him. If he loves him, let him rescue him. That's almost verbatim what the gospel says the scribes and Pharisees were saying to him. 1,000 years ahead of time, the prophet had prophesied this. Many bulls surround me. Fierce bulls of Bashan encircle me. Guess who that is? Jesus' enemies. They open their mouths against me, lions rend and roar. Like water, my life drains away. All my bones are disjointed. His shoulder, by the way, was dislocated, amongst other things. My heart has become like wax. It melts away within me. Dogs surround me. A pack of evildoers closes in on me. Again, the scribes and Pharisees would be thinking through the words of the psalm and realizing, who are the dogs? Who are the evildoers? Well, it's the same people that were saying things like he relied on God, let God save him. That's us. They stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. The Romans did that. The Romans had no idea about the psalm. But then, interestingly, the psalm changes the tone. It says, but you, Lord, do not stay far off. My strength come quickly to deliver me. It goes on to say later, he has not spurned or disdained the misery of this poor wretch, did not turn away from me, heard me when I cried out. I will offer praise in the great assembly. My vows I will fulfill before those who fear him. The poor will eat their fill. Those who seek the Lord will offer praise. May your hearts enjoy life forever. And it goes on. The psalm suddenly turns on a dime and suddenly it becomes a psalm of hope. That when the person that the psalmist wrote about 1,000 years before has gone through all this suffering, in the midst, or as a result of that, he will praise God, and God will bring him triumphant to the end of it, and he will become a source of blessing. All of that is in Psalm 22. And the scribes and Pharisees who had all the Psalms memorized, they would have been going through that and thinking, we're painted into this picture. What is happening? This person is the one that was predicted by the prophet years ago, and I'm watching it play out before me. Shouldn't this be cause for me to convert? And sadly, for most of them, the answer was no. And for each of us, we've grown up with the faith for the most part. And sometimes God allows us to see things that are self-evident truths, but nonetheless we have to choose. Do I want to accept it or not? He will never force us to accept. Even he can work miracles in front of us, but he never forces us to have faith. That comes down to us. And we can always ask ourselves, what is my response to you going to be, God? So the fifth word, I thirst. Now think about everything Jesus has been going through. Okay, he's been Last Supper, then he says, my heart is sorrowful to the point of death. So his heart is under such a burden that he almost is ready to die just of sadness and sorrow. He sweats blood, which is a medical phenomenon that is possible and is extremely agonizing. And normally most people would not survive the kind of stress that leads to sweating blood, but he did. One of the things that sweating blood does is it makes your skin hypersensitive, so even the lightest touch would be agonizing. It's kind of like being a burn victim, okay? And on that skin, he received a brutal scourging, and then was bound with ropes, and then, carried the cross and was crucified and was slowly asphyxiating to death, and all the different things he was going through, crowned with thorns, abandoned. And in the middle of this, he complains of being thirsty. You would think that there would be bigger concerns that he would have, right? It's true that he would have lost a whole lot of blood, and I'm sure he would have been burning with thirst. But it also seems like there could have been any number of things he could have asked for or complained about that would have been more pressing. Well, Mother Teresa, if you ever go to any of the missionaries of charity, their chapels, you will always see a large crucifix and next to it the words, I thirst. And her understanding, which frankly came from a vision of Jesus Christ to her personally, so therefore it bears some weight, is that when Christ appeared to her, he said, I want nuns that are going to quench my thirst for love. What Christ was thirsting for was love and recognition of his love, at least gratitude, at least gaze upon me and see and recognize the love that I have for you. Can you imagine, going through something like that for your children and then just turning their back, thanks mom, thanks dad, don't care, gotta go, and you're just like, why won't you trust in my love? Well, this is very much Christ's complaint. There is also another dimension to it, which will be our next word. It is finished. Jesus, it's interesting, it says, I'm thirsty, or I thirst. And the very next line in the gospel says, so a guard went with a sprig on a sponge on a sprig of hyssop and brought it to his mouth, and it was sour wine or vinegar, but it was wine. Not very good wine, but it was wine of sorts, okay? That's important. Because after he drinks the vinegar or the sour wine from the sponge, he says, it is finished. Again, why would he say that? Weird timing, Jesus. Why would you feel like, okay, I've had my drink of wine, now it's all done? Well, there's a reason. The Last Supper, which began the night before, was a Passover liturgy. And it was, when we celebrate the Mass, we are the continuation, if you want, of what happened at the Last Supper and of the crucifixion and all the way through the resurrection. Okay, the Passover liturgy for the Jewish people to this day, it is called a memorial. A memorial doesn't just mean, remember what I did for you at the Red Sea, but it means that it's kind of like you're entering into a time machine and you go back in time and space and you participate in that original moment. And when Jewish people piously enter into the Passover supper, it's almost a sacramental thing that they're entering into the original Passover, the angel of death killing the firstborn and the Israelite people crossing the Red Sea and entering into the desert where they would eventually form a covenant with God. And all of that is kind of being lived in a Passover celebration for pious Jews. Well, in our Mass, it's the same thing. That's why at the consecration, Jesus says, do this in memory of me. There's a sacrament that takes place. We go back, we enter into the one sacrifice which began in the Last Supper and continued in the crucifixion and onward. Well, this comes from this phrase. And the connection is this. In the Last Supper liturgy, there were different cups of wine. So there were 4 major cups of blessing or wine in a Passover supper. When Jesus did the famous words, "This is my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant, which will be poured out for you for the remission of sins. Do this in remembrance of me," or in memory of me. That was the 3rd cup. It's called the cup of blessing. And there have been Jewish people that have studied the Last Supper, and they said it's like he never finished. He didn't finish the Passover. It would be like if we celebrate Mass, we get as far as the consecration and then say, okay, go home. You don't get to go to communion. There's no Our Father. There's no final blessing. Nothing. It's just you leave the Mass half done. Okay, that's apparently what happened in the Gospels. Jesus kind of got to a point and he finished. But during the Gospel, he had said in the Gospel of John, in one of those chapters, somewhere between chapter 13 and 17, he said, this blood, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine again until you enter into the kingdom in its glory. Okay? The next day, at the end of the crucifixion, what happens? Somebody brings wine to him. He tastes of the fruit of the vine, the sponge full of sour wine. And at that moment, he says, it is finished. I've finished the liturgy, the Mass, that began in the Last Supper, has continued all the way through the scourging and the crowning with thorns and all the elements of the Passion. And now he is finally entering into the new covenant. He says, it is finished, and then he gives up his last breath. But there was one last word. Because before he gives up his last breath, what does he say? He says something that I just buried. Where'd it go? There it is. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. This, when I'm in my more prayerful moments, which is very rare, this in my more prayerful moments, these are the words that kind of hit me like a dagger in the heart. Because remember when Jesus said, my heart is sorrowful unto death. Stay with me and pray. Okay, what that means is from the moment the Passion began, as Jesus walked from the upper room towards the Mountain of Olives, and as he was walking, which is, I'm going to guess, maybe about a kilometer walk, maybe a little more. While he was on the road is when he started becoming troubled in heart and feeling the full weight of the passion beginning, which led to the sweating of blood and everything. He has been betrayed and abandoned by his apostles. The religious leaders supposed to represent him and lead the people of God are turning people away from him. He's been scourged and crowned. But more than anything, like I said, he's carrying this sickening weight of every sin in humanity. Now, this is a human heart. Have you ever, well, everyone here has at one moment or another felt really guilty when you knew you've done something really wrong. You feel just bad. As one girl, when I was in high school, told me, I feel crunchy. Okay? You just feel crunchy because you know you did something really bad. Okay? Jesus felt crunchy for every sin in human history. Now, what does that come down to? That includes Auschwitz, the entire Holocaust, and Mao Zedong with his 60 million people in his own pogroms, and Stalin and his 40 millions, and every, whatever evils were done in the Inquisition, every torture, every rape, every lie, every marital infidelity, name your sin. Every one of those, he's feeling, and he's feeling that I am responsible before God for these. Now, there's another thing that I forgot to mention. There is an expression in the Bible, cursed is the man who hangs on a cross, which is why the scribes and Pharisees wanted Jesus to be crucified. It wasn't only so they could be mean and make him suffer more, although I'm sure that was in there. The word cursed is the man who was hanged on a tree, rather, but which meant crucifixion, means that it was a death that was so horrible that it was considered that you had been cursed and cast off by God. And therefore, it was considered to be like, well, this guy's condemned to hell, and he's beginning it right now. Which is why the Jewish leadership said, stick him on a cross so that everyone will see this is not the Messiah. This is not somebody who represents God. He's been cursed and abandoned by God. Okay? Jesus was crucified, and he's in the middle of all of this. And in the middle of this, he's able to turn to his Father and still say, Father, into your hands I trust, I commend my spirit. What an absolute act of confidence and trust in God. Now, which one of us has ever felt like, I can't go to confession, or I will never be able to reconcile with this person? But it was even more so, like, if you knew, Father, the sins that I have, and we let ourselves go year in and year out, cut off from God, because we don't trust in his mercy. Christ felt every single sin, and he felt it much more poignantly than we ever would. He felt the responsibility for all of that, and he was dying a death by which it seemed, it was an indication that you were cursed by God, and he nonetheless had the faith and the confidence in his Father to say, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And with that, he breathed his last. This kind of trust is, frankly, humanly impossible. None of us will ever be able to have this kind of trust on our own. But it is accessible to every single one of us if we are men and women who pray. Who pray. And I think maybe that can be, we are in the last days. Next week is already Holy Week. And Father Augustine is giving us a lot of opportunities to pray together as a community. That's why we have a Holy Week. So my cordial invitation is going to be, well, first of all, tomorrow, take advantage of confession. If Christ, under these circumstances, can turn to the Father and say, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, then any one of us should be able to approach God the Father with great confidence, knowing that There is no sin that he is not willing to forgive as long as we bring it to him in trust and humility. And let's be men and women, if we want to live the remainder of our Lent well, then we got to pray. We got to spend real time in contact with Christ. Find spaces of silence. Read the Bible. Let God's word penetrate you, so that our faith stops being just kind of a cultural thing that we do. It becomes truly a relationship with a person that we know, that we love, and that we know loves us. And in the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.